Welcome everyone back to our studies of AQA A-level politics. We're continuing in this lesson talking about a variety of different issues in UK politics. And we're moving on to topic number 8 in this lesson. Topic number 8 concerns political parties. Now, we're going to begin the first 3 lessons of this series by talking about the origins, the ideas, and the development of each of the different main political parties of the time. So we're going to begin in this lesson by talking about the origins and the development of the UK Conservative Party. Now, in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party is one of the oldest political parties, in fact, in the world, and it has a rich history which spans over at least 2 centuries. Now, its origins can be traced all the way back to the late 17th century, particularly in the aftermath of something known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So, for those of you who study A-level history and maybe do the Stuarts module or maybe do the English Revolution module, whichever specification that you do, you'll be very familiar with the Glorious Revolution, or at least the historical context of the Glorious Revolution. But fundamentally, for those of you who don't study A-level history, the Glorious Revolution saw the overthrow of King James II and the ascension of William III and Mary II, William of Orange. Now, the reason why King James II was overthrown was because James was Catholic, and ever since Henry VIII split from the Church in Rome and created the Church of England, the Anglican Church, there's obviously a very long history of anti-Catholicism in England at the time, especially when thinking about the reaction to Protestantism under Mary I, aptly named Bloody Mary. At this time, though, we can see that British politics was polarised between 2 major factions, with the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories were primarily composed of supporters of the monarchy, the Anglican Church, and the aristocracy. They were characterised by their loyalty to the crown and their opposition to the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. Parliamentary sovereignty, of course, for those of you who remember all the way back to our lessons on parliamentary sovereignty, dates as far back as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. By contrast, then, we see that the Whigs favoured parliamentary supremacy, they favoured civil liberties, and they favoured the limitation of the royal prerogative, of royal power. We could see that the Tory party would start to evolve during the 18th century, representing royalist tradition and also conservative interests. In particular, the Tories began to advocate for a strong monarchy, the established church, and social hierarchy that was based specifically on land ownership. We see that in the early 19th century, the Tory party undergoes significant political and social changes. This is the result of things like the expansion of industrialisation, of urbanisation, and the rise of the new social classes. The political environment shifted, and the old Tory party began to change in response. Now, for those of you who studied the Industrial Revolution in A-level history, you will be familiar with William Pitt the Younger. William Pitt the Younger was Prime Minister from 1783 to 1801, and then again from 1804 to 1806, hence why I've put this sort of the general period in which he was operating. And William Pitt the Younger is often considered to be a key figure in the process of transition of the Tory party into the modern Conservative Party that we know it today. He, for example, advocated for fiscal conservatism, for a strong central government, as well as an expansionist foreign policy. Think about the context of the British Empire during this time as well. Examples of legislations and major political changes that take place during this period of time can be seen with things like the 19th century Reform Acts. The Reform Acts of 1832, of 1867 and 1884 all significantly expanded the electorate and transformed the political landscape. The result is that the Conservative Party adapted to these changes by broadening its appeal beyond that of just the aristocracy, incorporating the new middle classes, the landowning class. The Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829 was another such example of a transition into the Conservative Party. It was a provision which was championed by Sir Robert Peel and marked another turning point. Peel was a key figure in the transition from the Tory tradition to what becomes known as the modern Conservative Party today. And the emancipation of Catholics essentially allowed, through this legislation, people who were Catholic to hold office and to vote, signalling a more inclusive politics. In the 1830s, under Peel's leadership, the Tory party begins to embrace pragmatism and the idea of reform and reformism. This shift formalized, past tense, when Peel's government enacted important reforms, such as, on screen here, the 1846 repeal of the Corn Laws. Essentially what this did was sought to reduce tariffs on imported grain. The Corn Laws were seen as a protectionist measure that benefited the landed aristocracy but hurt the urban poor and the middle classes. Protectionism is essentially the process of, when we think about international trade, if you have protectionist policies, they're policies that are aiming to protect your domestic industry rather than allowing for liberalization of trade instead. And so reducing tariffs results in trade liberalization. Imposing tariffs on certain goods, especially those that are produced domestically as well, is imposing protectionism. The policy of repealing the Corn Laws, though, did alienate many of the members of the traditional Tory aristocracy, and in fact led to a split within the Tory party. The group of moderates who supported Peel's reforms and the more progressive economic policies eventually became the core of what becomes now the modern Conservative Party. And so the term Conservative Party came into use during the 1830s, as the Tories began to rebrand themselves to appeal to the growing middle class and the emerging industrial economy. Under Sir Robert Peel, and then later under Benjamin Disraeli, the party embraces more modern and pragmatic approaches to government and to governance. And so when we think about Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who was Prime Minister very briefly in 1868 and then lost that election later on that year, and then again from 1874 to 1880, Disraeli was pivotal in reshaping the Conservative Party into a national party. He advocated for an idea known as one nation conservatism. For those of you who are following along with the political ideas section, you will know already what one nation conservatism is. But it essentially sought to balance the interests of the aristocracy with the needs of the working class and the urban poor. It was an approach that was in direct contrast to the more laissez-faire policy or philosophy of the Liberal Party, which was on the other side of the spectrum that was beginning to gain more traction. More on the Liberal Party in future videos. Disraeli's policies were influential in shaping the modern Conservative Party. He emphasised the importance of imperialism in the British Empire, of national unity, and the paternalistic role of the state, the idea that the state should have to care for its citizens, especially that of the working class. An example of this is, of course, the 1867 Reform Act. This act extended the right to vote to more working class men in urban areas, giving the Conservatives a chance to appeal to the larger electorate. Now, Disraeli in particular recognises the potential for the Conservative Party to win over the urban working class by offering these kinds of social reforms and a sense of national pride. Now, at the time, the 1867 Reform Act was intended on the part of Disraeli and others in the party to secure victory in the election. But in fact, Disraeli does not win the next election and only gets back into office in 1874. By the early 20th century, then, the Conservative Party had firmly established itself as one of the two major political forces alongside the Labour Party, of course. The rise of the Labour Party, which was more advocating for socialism and workers' rights, led the Conservative Party to take more cautious approaches when it came to welfare and economic policies. Conservatives, particularly under leaders such as that of Stanley Baldwin and eventually Neville Chamberlain, were seen as defenders of the status quo, defending capitalism, defending private property, and defending individualism. Of course, we can't talk about the development of British politics during the 20th century without reference to the First World War, the Second World War, and the impact of the interwar period. We see that the interwar period sees the rise of fascism in places like Italy, in places like Germany, in places like Spain, and we also see socialism in places like Russia, soon to become the Soviet Union in 1917-1918. In the UK, the Conservative Party tried to distance itself from the extremes and instead continued to support a mixed economy with both public and private elements. The most important point of history during this early period of the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century, is of course the leadership of Winston Churchill under the Conservatives during the Second World War. This period of time saw the promotion of national unity and resilience. It also saw a time where we get a war coalition. We get a coalition between parties. So the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party all agreed to cease elections, and they all work together in government to create a system where they can actually fight a war, a world war, while also keeping everything together on the home front. And that's one of the reasons why we see that the Labour Party wins in 1945 under Clement Attlee. There is this sort of, it's a kind of weird quirk of history that the Conservatives lost immediately after the end of the Second World War. And why was that the case? They won the Second World War. Surely Winston Churchill is a national hero. Well, there was a few reasons why that was the case. One of the reasons was on the home front, Clement Attlee did a lot of work dealing with and promoting himself as a leader in peacetime, a leader in wartime, on the home front. And so his popularity would continue to grow and to grow and to grow. And there was also this assumption that Winston Churchill didn't need to do much campaigning or didn't need to do much in terms of trying to win the election because the election was already in the bag. There was this sort of braggadocious nature of the Conservatives winning the Second World War. And so the result of that was that the electorate responded by kicking them out for a short period of time in the late 1940s, and we see that Labour sweep a victory. Labour also promised social welfare reforms during this time as well, which of course became very, very popular at a time when there was very little in terms of what anybody had. There was still rationing, there was still lots of different things going on that meant people were craving for things like social welfare reforms. The result is that the welfare state is created, the establishment of the National Health Service, for example. After the Second World War, then, we see a period of what is known as post-war consensus. And this is where we see both major political parties agreeing on a number of very key areas of policy. So both agreed on the importance of the welfare state, the importance of the NHS, as well as the importance of some nationalisations of industries. The Conservative Party was led under Winston Churchill, and then very shortly, for a short period of time, under Anthony Eden, and then for a longer period of time under both Harold Macmillan and Edward Heath. They accepted much of the welfare state infrastructure that was established by the Labour Party, but then began to advocate for more market economy and private enterprise. That is what we sort of know as this sort of period of post-war consensus. And it's a period that lasts until the 1970s. And when we get to the 1970s, of course, we have to think about the rise of Thatcherism and the New Right. The rise of Margaret Thatcher was probably the biggest transformation in the Conservative Party in the 20th century. Thatcher became party leader in 1975 and then became Prime Minister from 1979 all the way until 1990. Essentially, Thatcherism represented a radical departure from this idea of post-war consensus, with a shift towards more free market policies, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, as well as the concept of individualism and the reduction of state interference. Thatcher's policies were sweeping, and they were very, very impactful. We see the privatisation of state-owned industries. We see the reduction of income tax and corporation tax. We see a strong stance on trying to control inflation and reduce public spending. We see the dismantling and the attacking of trade unions and curbing their authority. We see the promotion of individual home ownership, particularly through the right to buy scheme, which essentially allowed council tenants to purchase their homes. So the impact of Thatcher was an incredible period of time. So Thatcher transforms the Conservative Party into a party of free market capitalism and individualism. Now, she was very popular among some and very unpopular among others. But it's probably the impact of Thatcher that leads to the failure of the Conservatives in 1997 with the rise of New Labour. So Thatcher was very impactful, but she was very controversial. And then John Major, by contrast, was relatively was actually a lot better than what people make out in terms of his politics and in terms of his approach to politics and the way he was able to govern. But it was just another example of the Conservatives being in power for probably just a little bit too long. So Thatcher's policies, of course, moves us towards the end of the post-war consensus, moves the Conservative Party away from its earlier paternalistic one-nation conservatism towards a more libertarian neoliberal tradition of the new right. The Conservatives then, after John Major, are booted out of office for a very long period of time, from 1997 all the way until sort of 2010 and then fully until 2015. And this gives us the rise of modern conservatism. Arguably the most important character within modern conservatism is the leadership of David Cameron. David Cameron led the Conservative Party from 2005 to 2016. He led the Conservative Party through a period of economic recovery after the 2008 financial crisis. His leadership is characterized by more centrist approaches to politics and also focusing on quite a lot of very socially progressive values. So social justice, green energy, gay marriage, all while maintaining conservative values when it came to things like the economy and foreign policy. Now, the downfall of Cameron, of course, was in fact the Brexit referendum, which was an attempt to address growing divisions within his party, but led to him losing that vote and getting booted out of office. He would then return very briefly under Sunak as foreign chancellor, foreign secretary, and then again leaving office, presumably for good at this point. The Brexit referendum of 2016, of course, led to a seismic shift within the Conservative Party. We see a number of different leaders taking the reins. We see Theresa May, at least in the initial stage, for a few years, and then Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson ultimately leads us to leaving the European Union, but then fails spectacularly when thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic. And his idea of populist conservatism was sadly rejected when he ultimately again gets booted out of office himself. The period of Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, of course, is probably one of the most seismic periods in terms of conservative instability at this time. So Liz Truss famously was in office for a period of about 40 or so days and was widely considered to be a spectacular failure on all accounts. Her mini budget collapsed the economy, of course, and we see that Liz Truss was just completely and utterly inept as a political leader. And so we get Rishi Sunak for a period of time, but really at this point, the Conservatives had been in power since 2010, firstly as a coalition and then fully from 2015 in complete control and authority. And so the idea of change was something that was going to take place, especially when we think about the sort of political dynamics of inflation and the sort of anti-incumbency that we see around the world during the 2024-2025 period. And so ultimately, when the Labour Party regained control last year, they did so with a spectacularly large majority, a similar, not quite the same size, I don't believe, but similar to that of 1997. And so right now, the Conservatives are in a very strange place, because fundamentally they are operating under the leadership of Kemi Badenoch. There is, of course, questions about whether Kemi Badenoch would actually be able to become Prime Minister. And then there's also the threat of reform. The Reform Party seems to be driving a lot of those further right voters towards them in growing numbers. The threat of people like Nigel Farage and Richard Tice is creating quite a strong amount of impact. And Badenoch is in a position where she is trying to probably go more towards leaning into those populist right movements, but doing so in a way that tries to separate her from the Reform Party is, of course, a very difficult issue. Ultimately, we'll probably not see many great movements in the Conservative Party for a while, and some have even argued that the Conservative Party might be in its decline and ultimately within its collapse. If it merges with the Reform Party, for example, and forms something new, then we see that this is the end of the Conservative Party as we know it, and we see that there's a different party that will emerge from the ashes. And so fundamentally then, this is a period of history that stretches back many hundreds of years. We see that it begins in the 1600s, develops through industrialization, develops under people like Benjamin Disraeli, and then comes out of the Second World War as one of the most popular parties in the country. It spikes in its popularity under Thatcher and then collapses to its lowest levels under Blair and under Brown, and then we get a period of around 13 or so years under Cameron, under Theresa May, under Boris Johnson, under Liz Truss, and under Rishi Sunak, of partial stability on the one hand, but also quite significant instability on the other. And really the time right now is a point at which we see the Conservative Party is in flux. It is not known, it is not necessarily clear whereabouts the Conservative Party will go in the future, especially with the threat to reform that we are seeing as well as time goes on.